Welcome, everybody, to another edition of On This Day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm your host for On This Day, Mike Goodpaster. Today we're going to talk about March the 15th, 1958. The Cincinnati Royals had just lost to Detroit in the playoffs. After the game, the Royals players watched their power forward Maurice Stokes throw up in the toilet. The guys figured Stokes was drunk. He'd had a couple of beers. Hell, all of them had. When the Royals owner walked by, the players thought, "Don't let him see Mo like this." Stokes was the best thing about the Royals. He was a classic big-shouldered, double-digit rebounder, a 230-pound moose of a man, Oscar Robertson once said. But Stokes could also run the court and drive to the basket. Today we'd say he had athleticism. He was probably the first 6'7" guy that could play guard. You know, Stokes was great because no players from the 50s can agree on which all-timer he resembled the most. Dolph Schayes of the Syracuse Nationals compared him to a Magic Johnson type or a LeBron James type. Bob Cousy, the great Boston Celtics, said he was a forerunner to great forwards, Dr. J and Elgin Baylor. Mo would have been a Hall of Famer. Stokes was a puckish figure. He sent his teammate Jim Paxson Sr. to buy show tickets in New York, and when Paxson came back with an obstructed view ticket, Stokes never let him forget about it. He walked around in three-button suits, said Monk Minky, a Royals forward at the time. He wore black glasses. He looked like a Rhodes Scholar. On the road, Stokes would pay a maid to go into Minky's room and wash his shirts. He'd leave a note that said, "Monk, you're in the pros. Dress like it." Stokes' injury began with a play in Minneapolis in the last game of the 1958 regular season. The Lakers' Slick Leonard said Stokes drove to the hoop, got his legs cut out from under him, and smacked his head against the floor. A news photo shows Stokes on his knees, his head buried in his hands. He went on to play the rest of the game and had 24 points and 19 rebounds. 3 days later, Stokes played slow and heavy-legged in a loss in Detroit. Still had 12 points and 15 rebounds. Then Stokes began to feel ill. On the way home, "I was sick too," said Paxson. "They threw everyone off the scent. Maybe Mo and Jim have the flu," the Royals thought. The flu excuse made sense. At the Detroit airport, Stokes handed his bags to a teammate, walked into a bathroom, and threw up. Sometime later, he threw up again. When he got to the ramp of the plane, his whole body began to ache. "He kind of keeled over," said Tom Marshall, a Royals forward. "Dick Ricketts and Jack Twyman were there, and we helped him on the plane." Stokes could have been packed in an ambulance and sent to a Detroit hospital. But a hangover or a little flu was surely something the Royals' doctor could handle back in Cincinnati. The Royals' plane took off. Within a few minutes, Stokes was covered in sweat. "I feel like I'm going to die," he cried. He said nothing else. Stokes' teammates thought he'd passed out. But Stokes was very aware of the events of the next several minutes. He saw a flight attendant place an oxygen mask over his mouth. He heard Richie Regan, a Royals guard, invoke the emergency provision that allows a layman to baptize a dying man into the Catholic Church. Stokes had been toying with Catholicism. The baptism pleased him. But Stokes could not respond. A rigid neurological barrier had formed between what Stokes could see and what he was able to do. It was a lonely sensation he compared later to being buried alive. "Nobody knew what the hell the problem was," said Celtics Hall of Famer Tommy Heinsohn. "I'm not sure they do to this day." Indeed, when the Royals talked about how bad they felt for Mo, they didn't see much about the injury. Even when they heard it diagnosed as post-traumatic encephalopathy, they couldn't make much sense of it. Weren't football players the ones that were carried off the field as vegetables? That just didn't happen in basketball. The plane landed in Cincinnati. Stokes remembered a half a dozen players carrying his corpse-like body down the stairs. Paxson said the rest of the players stayed put and craned their necks to look out the airplane windows. They watched paramedics load Stokes onto an ambulance. When he opened his eyes in a hospital, Stokes could not move his limbs, and he couldn't speak. Jack Twyman was a 6'6" Royals forward. He was sitting one row in front of Stokes on the plane. On the surface, the two men had a lot in common. They were both from Pittsburgh and had played each other in high school summer leagues. But in basketball terms, Twyman was Stokes' intellectual opposite. Stokes was a rebounder and an on-court genius. Twyman just wanted to shoot. His favorite line in warm-ups was, "Right back, baby." He didn't play much defense. Dolph Shays once said about Twyman, "When I played against him, I'd score 30, he'd score 35. We guarded each other. I used to joke that I got him into the Hall of Fame, and he got me into the Hall of Fame." Monk Mink said, "Maurice and Jack never got along when they played. During one game with the Royals, Twyman took 3 shots. He missed them all. Stokes rubbled under the boards, snagged all 3 rebounds. On the next possession, Twyman did what came naturally. He shot the ball again. He missed. Timeout was called, and Stokes told Twyman to cut it the fuck out. That was Twyman. He was a bottomless pit of self-confidence. While he was still playing basketball, he sold insurance. He later parlayed that into a richly compensated job as a CEO of a wholesale food distributor. Like I told you, Paxson said, he was a shooter. When the shooter decided to devote his life to caring for Stokes, he was just 24 years old. Twyman told a teammate, "What am I going to do? I'm from Pittsburgh. He's from Pittsburgh. He didn't have any family here. I just want to do it." Maybe it was naivete, said his son, Jay Twyman. "If you were really smart and thought things through, you'd say it was impossible to raise $100,000 a year for Maurice's hospital bills." The contracts to play pro ball at the time averaged around $15,000 a year. Twyman was white, Stokes was black. Twyman understood the optics, but the optics didn't mean anything to him. He was friends with a lot of black basketball players, and nobody made much money, which he felt drew everybody closer. Twyman's management of Stokes' life was complete. Stokes' dad worked at a steel mill back in Pittsburgh and didn't get to Cincinnati much. In April, Twyman actually petitioned the courts to become Maurice's legal guardian. He became Stokes' accountant, his health specialist, and his communication director with the world. Stokes could not speak at the time, so Twyman stood at his bedside and ran through the letters of the alphabet, asking Stokes to blink when he got to the first letter of the first word he wanted to say. A, Twyman would ask, no response from Maurice. B, no response. C, when Stokes blinked, Twyman would hunt for the second letter, ABC. In the fall of 1958, Stokes' hotel room became a mandatory stop for NBA teams that were playing the Royals. Many players were unnerved by his giant, inert form. Stokes' injuries still didn't make sense to them. They tended to avoid touching or hugging Stokes. They stood at the edge of the bed, cracked a few jokes, and left. "See you next time, Mo," they'd say. Stokes would blink. "I'll be here." Twyman kept no such distance. He and Stokes were intellectual rivals, sarcastic friends, and they were still arguing the point that came up that day in the huddle. "What's wrong with being a rebounder?" Maurice once asked. "A guy like you had to be a rebounder," Twyman said. "You couldn't hit the first shot, so you had to get the second or the third." In 1958, the NBA had no pension plan. The Royals cut Stokes after his injury, so he had no income. Twyman figured he'd need to make a perpetual cash generator to keep Stokes alive. That fall, Twyman was playing in New York when he got to talk with a hoteler named Milton Kuchner. Kutcher, who was nuts for basketball, suggested a charity game at his hotel in the Catskill Mountains. "I'll provide the rooms and the food," Kutcher said, "if you bring the best players in the NBA." Twyman got on the phone and started calling his pals. On August 4th, 1959, NBA players began pulling into the oblong drive at Kutcher's Hotel and Country Club in the Catskills. Twyman had hoped to get 10 guys, enough for a game, but while he was making calls, so were Kutcher's PR man Haskell Cohen, a former NBA PR director, who worked in the league office. Cars pulled up with tags from New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Ohio. They got 30 players. Kutcher's was a glittering star in the constellation of Jewish resorts in the Catskills. It sat atop a wooden hill in the town of Monticello, which the locals called Monticello. Kutcher's has an 18-hole golf course, a cosmetics counter, and a nightclub that had featured everybody from Jackie Mason to Alan King. You could spot the additions to the hotel by the subtle change in the carpet patterns. The Catskills might seem like a strange place for basketball, but since the late 40s, Kutcher's had been recruiting college basketball players for jobs as bellhops and waiters. At night, the bellhops became ringers on the hotel's house team. While he was winning world titles with the Celtics, Red Auerbach coached the summer team at Kutcher's. Wilt Chamberlain was a Kutcher's bellhop. Basketball players were hired entertainers, the new Catskill comedians. As Bob Cousy said, it was an opportunity to make some money and meet some girls. We went up, having never been kissed. We were outnumbered 15-1 by all these horny New York City girls who came up for their vacation. The jocks looked juicier than the average waiter, I guess, Cousy said. The first year I worked as a waiter, I came home with $1,500 in twos and ones. They still had $2 bills back then. I came home and dumped all the money on the table. My mother called the police because that was the most money she'd ever seen at one time, and she was sure that I robbed a grocery store. Now, the Stokes game was based on the same idea, except with more star power. Dolph Shaye says, we're not talking about second-tier players. We're talking about Russell, Chamberlain, Cousy, and Havlicek. The players paid their own way and up and back for the game site. Kutcher selected a simple asphalt court next to a maple tree. The backboards were made of wood, and Kutcher's was stenciled on them in large script. The hotel staff acted as if they were throwing the world's biggest bar mitzvah. They built wooden bleachers. They ordered green and gold uniforms. Kutcher told his son Mark that he could come to the game as long as he helped out. At 8:30, fans crowded around the court, with a newsreel camera whirring. August 1959 was a lucky time to start the game. Wilt Chamberlain, the old Kutcher's bellhop, was to make his NBA debut. The Stokes game was actually the first varied look at how Chamberlain would fare against the pros. Auerbach, who was coaching the original team, unleashed his goons. Boston's Jim Los Cutoff and Detroit's Walter Dukes, who just led the NBA in foul-outs. They dogpiled Chamberlain. Chamberlain didn't even play a full half and finished with 20 points, 14 rebounds, and 10 blocks. It was absolutely a statement, said Mark Kutcher. Not only I can play with you guys, which they knew and he knew, but I'm going to be the best thing you ever saw. He's going to drive coaches to the nut house, Auerbach moaned after the game. Fuzzy Levain, the Knicks coach, was already there. He complained that Chamberlain was goaltending. Chamberlain said, they'll keep yelling until the ref calls a few bad blocks. Next thing, they'll raise the baskets to 12 feet. The Stokes game was like the All-Star game with a deeper bench. It was almost a secret. Around 3,000 fans saw it live. Moviegoers saw a little over a minute of newsreel footage, and the Kutchers collected $4,000 for Stokes' convalescence. After the game, a Kutcher's employee asked the best players in the world to return the jerseys. They would need them for the next year. And everybody was coming back. Now, Twyman had all sorts of ideas to raise money for Stokes. Twyman invited big-time sports columnists into the hotel room. He didn't do it often, and he picked guys like the LA Times' Jim Murray or the Post's Milton Gross, guys who could write the soulful human interest stories Twyman wanted. After the columns appeared, readers would send envelopes full of money, which piled up in Maurice's room. Stokes wanted the nurses to write a thank you note to everybody, but it was impossible. When someone suffers a catastrophic injury, recovery takes on its own psychology. First, a phony goal is set forth. I'll be back playing basketball with the Royals, Stokes declared early on. Then a realistic goal is set forth. In Stokes' case, that was walking under his own power. The people around him believed He could have walked had he lived longer. "Yes, sir, I do," said his physical therapist, Charles Elopoulos. "At the time when I was working with him, we had him in braces. They were the longest that were ever made, I think. They went clear over his shoulders and were attached to his shoes. With parallel bars, he would shuffle his feet along without me helping him for a distance of 8 to 10 feet. Stokes' mornings began with the nurse feeding him breakfast. It was real food, eggs, and cereal. And then the physical therapy would start, and when the physical therapist got there, Stokes' plate was always clean. The physical therapist would pull Stokes out of bed, use a pivot to maneuver him into a wheelchair, and take him to a whirlpool. Then the therapist would stretch his muscles, which made Stokes scream in agony. "The sweat pours off him like it's pouring off of a shower," Twyman once observed. Stokes took a nap around midday, ate lunch, and repeated his therapy in the afternoon. Dinner was New York cut sirloins, procured by Twyman, with veggies and a dessert. Twyman came to the hospital nearly every day on his way home from practice. When he got within 10 feet of the room, he could hear Stokes laughing. After a while, Twyman started bringing his kids, Lisa and Jay. He was careful to describe Stokes as a man rather than his ward. It was never phrased in such a blatant way, "This is your brother, I adopted him," Jay Twyman said. It was, "This is the man we're helping out." People often said Stokes was never bitter about his injury. The claim should be treated with suspicion because Stokes couldn't communicate what was in his head. He smiled a lot, though. His lower jaw would drop open like a nutcracker, and the corner of his mouth would curl slightly. That smile had a way of convincing visitors that Stokes was at peace. Twyman would go into the hospital in the dumps and come out bouncing. Jim Paxson, his old teammate, said Maurice couldn't do anything, but he could do everything, if you know what I mean. Stokes learned to speak again eventually. His words came out as stuttering moan. Everyone in the room would go silent except for Twyman, who recognized what Stokes was saying. "Oh, come on, Maurice," Twyman would say, and they both started cracking up. As part of Stokes' therapy, the hospital staff hung a sling near his bed. Stokes placed his left wrist in the sling and allowed him to suspend his hand above a nearby typewriter. Stokes typed his first sentence for Twyman. It was a difficult task, and it took him about a week to complete. The sentence read, "How can I ever thank you for all you've done?" The Stokes game wasn't a cupcake like today's game. When a guy drove the baseline at the Stokes game, 5 defenders didn't take a synchronous step to the left to let him dunk. The Bullets' Kevin Greavy said, "Listen, I nearly got killed in one of those games. It was a Knicks or a Nets player. I can't remember which one. I went to the basket and he nearly took his head off." The Pacers' Lynn Elmore said, "Wilt was a god when I was there. He was absolutely in awe. One time he went up for a shot. I couldn't stop him, so I tried to foul him. I got caught on his wrist and almost lifted off the ground." Chamberlain was the Stokes game's prime attraction, his chief bullshitter. After the game, a crowd would form around Chamberlain in the Kutcher's coffee shop while he gulped down plates of food. Wilt would hold court and talk about how good he was at things. Everything. And the first challenger to Chamberlain's Stokes supremacy was Lou Alcindor. The two had a history at Kutcher's. Chamberlain had invited Alcindor to the Catskills when Alcindor was a New York high school player. Alcindor's first Stokes game in 1969, on an early possession, he dunked on Chamberlain. Chamberlain got the ball back and unleashed a dunk that modern announcers would have called emphatic. "If Kareem didn't move out of the way," said Mark Kutcher, "he'd have been going through the backboard with the ball." Since the Stokes game took place between the NBA draft at the start of the season, it became a proving ground for every heralded rookie. Kevin Lawfrey from the Bullets said, "I remembered Pete Maravich was in awe of that game." And this was in 1970 when Pistol Pete was the third pick in the draft. Maravich was so much in awe, he shot 4 for 18. His passes hit guys in the head. The Celtics' Dave Cowens, who had been taken with the fourth pick, had 32 points, 22 rebounds, and Kutcher remembers seeing a shit-eating grin forming behind Red Auerbach's cigar. In 1971, the Kutchers figured they could no longer ask the best basketball players in the world to play on asphalt. So they moved the game to a drafty, barn-like gym down the road. A few of the Celtics thought it resembled the Boston Garden, only with fewer seats. To complete the effect, Auerbach donated the original pre-parquet garden floor to Milt Kutcher. Cousy showed up at the Stokes game, bounced the ball a couple of times, and declared, "Same dead spots." The NBA didn't yet have a formal off-season. The Stokes game became a place where business was transacted. Actually, in 1965, Sixers owner Ike Reichman came to Kutcher's and signed Chamberlain to a $100,000 a year contract. When Phillies coach Dolph Schayes was asked how he felt about the deal, Schayes answered, "Poor." Starting in the late 60s, the players powwowed to discuss the NBA-ABA merger. In 1964, the Stokes game marked the debut of the NBA's new 16-foot wide lane, and a dozen years later, of Tiny Archibald's newly shorn head. Once basketball players had been summoned to Kutcher's, like Yiddish comedians, now they came in as rich men on holiday. Danny Ainge was a great tennis player, said to the Celtics' ML Carr. One year Ainge said, "ML, you can't play. I don't have any sneakers, but I'll play you in socks." He beat me with socks on. Then Ainge said, "I'll play you with only my left hand." And then he beat me with only his left hand. The game went on into the early 90s and basically died out. I mean, when you got to the early 90s, you basically had NBA backups playing. Now, the great thing about this game was it sustained Maurice Stokes. It didn't have to sustain him until the 90s because Jack Twyman died March 30th, 1970. He suffered a heart attack while Twyman was out of town. Twyman dispatched his wife Carol to the hospital. Carol found Stokes on a stretcher with doctors bent over him. Stokes spotted her and moaned words to her. He died 6 days later. The hospital kept his body long enough for Twyman to return to Cincinnati and pay his respects. Stokes left behind an interesting piece of writing. And this is what he wrote. When the sun peeks over the horizon, it is the signal for the beginning of a new day. The beauty that the sun creates is something that words cannot describe. To me, one of the great satisfactions of living in the country is that you can get the real beauty of the sun without the obstruction of the smoke. Now, for the last 6 years of his life, Stokes had lived in a hospital room in downtown Cincinnati. I would think the country probably refers to the few days each year he spent in the Catskills. Now, Twyman gave up running the Stokes game after Maurice's death. He said, sadly, his mission was complete. But NBA players kept the game going. They did it for, an old Celtic who needed money. They did it for Gene Conley, a retired Knick who had a heart problem. Howard Porter, to start a 1971 NCAA tournament, needed money for rehab. An NBA widow called to say she couldn't afford to bury her husband. The Kutchers cut checks for all of them. By the mid-1970s, Stokes, the man, began to get indistinct and fuzzy again. Like Brian Piccolo, he'd become a media saint, a TV movie. Old-timers who knew him were increasingly the lifeblood of the Stokes game. Twyman and Chamberlain came every year. Auerbach, who was by then the general manager of the Celtics, told his players, "It's up to you, but consider it mandatory." One night in the late 70s, Kenny Albert, now a Fox play-by-play man, was shooting baskets at the old Kutcher's outdoor court with a pal, and he said it was like a scene from Field of Dreams. As out of the darkness appeared Oscar Robertson. Now, the reason the game died, there's a couple. The Catskills were disintegrating. And the movie Dirty Dancing came out in 1987, which is a lot like Kutcher's up in the Catskills. And the second problem was the NBA was growing. Clyde Drexler was the MVP of the '88 Stokes game, but Larry Magic and Michael never made the trip to Kutcher's. They couldn't risk their knees on a 30-year-old court. They had their own charities. Now, there are two ways to think about this. The gloomy way is the NBA had become barnacled by lawyers, agents, and insurers. The happy way is that the league was finally big enough to take care of its own. The Stokes game dissolved slowly. 5 years after Drexler won the MVP, the roster was down to guys like Danny Shays, Malik Sealy, and Anthony Mason. And Mason even forgot his shoes and had to drive back to his White Plains home to get them. Mark White, who was a camp counselor, was thrown onto the court so they could have two full teams. When Chamberlain died in 1999, just 2 months after his final trip to Kutcher's, they canceled the Stokes game. It lived on for a few more years as a pro-am golf tournament. Jack Twyman got a form of leukemia in 2006. He beat that, but it returned in 2012. Twyman received the news of his imminent death as gracefully as you'd expect. He was propped up by drugs, but his mind was working perfectly. Jay Twyman said, "My dad was so upset. He'd say, 'I feel young. I'm just too young.'" Did Jack mention Maurice in his final days? Jay was asked. And Jay said, "He'll kill me for this, but when he was in the hospital, he got a bed sore. You're lying in bed, you're going to get a bed sore. But he was so upset when he was getting treatment from the nurse, he'd look at me and say, 'Maurice never had a blemish.'" Jay Twyman laughed, and he said it was a contest between the shooter and the rebounder, had continued into the beyond. I think Stokes must have whispered to him, "Jack, you're a little wimp." So on this day, March 15th, 1958, Maurice Stokes' life was changed forever, and so was Jack Twyman. All right, guys, remember you check back for On This Day every day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. You can follow me at Grueling Truth. You can hear our podcast wherever you find sports podcasts. So for now, this has been Mike Goodpaster. You've been listening to On This Day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network, where the legends speak.